Hi, it's Alistair at Electric Scotland. Just doing my introduction to my weekly newsletter, this time for the 1st of March 2019. Right, on to the news stories that I've got for you this week. First story is churches no longer have to hold a Sunday service. This is a weekly Sunday service will no longer be compulsory for churches after a vote to change a 400-year-old law was passed by the Church of England's ruling body. It seems to me the Christian faith is way under pressure these days. I don't know. I do think, as an observation, I was brought up as a Christian myself. Certainly when I was younger, I went to church regularly, every Sunday really. This is both a boarding school in Scotland, because we had to dress up in our kilts to go to Sunday service, and then when we got back we could change back into our normal wear. In fact, a lot of the bus tours got to figure out that lots of little boys were dressed up in kilts, and so they would make a point of being around so that the tourists could see us all going to church or coming back out. It's a bit of fun, really. Anyway, it's kind of sad that, because I think the Christian faith is a good basis to grow up with. It's a shame that somehow our ministers have really let us down. I think they seem to be too caught up in the hierarchy of the church or something, and certainly a lot of the services and sermons they give are not that appropriate, really. So I think we need to call on getting better ministers that really have a drive to get things going. And of course we've lost the church service at school, because it used to be the assembly in the morning. It was always a wee church service and a prayer to get us going. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems with the Christian religion right now. Okay, anyway, next story I've got is better agree no deal now than accept the weakness and humiliation of the withdrawal agreement. It says approaching no deal at the 11th hour, as we may well now be doing, is clearly not ideal. It would have been much better if we had spent the last 2 years negotiating the Canada plus free trade deal, which was the logical outcome of the 2016 EU referendum. Totally agree with that sentiment. Next story is Scottish independence divorce negotiations would be tougher than Brexit. It says Scottish independence divorce negotiations over the share of assets and liabilities would be different and much tougher than Brexit, a report published today has found. And if you remember the paper that the SNP brought out, they indicated, we'll go through dead easy, no problems, you know. Well, clearly that was just ridiculous. And looking at Brexit and looking at where Scottish independence negotiations could go, it's going to be hell. It really is. Anyway, that's not to say we shouldn't do it, of course, but nevertheless, I think people's eyes need to be opened. Okay, next story is, what's wrong with the revised hydro scheme in Glen Etive? It says, following my post on the revisions to the Glen Etive hydro schemes on the shortest day, I went to take a closer look to compare what is being proposed compared with what is on the ground. Really interesting article, lots of pictures there as well. Of course, Clonmackintyre is very near to Glen Etive, and so it may be that access to their lands could be compromised. I don't know, but it's certainly of concern to the clan anyway. Okay, and Virgin's Unity plane rockets skyward. It says Mr. Mackay from Helmsdale in Sutherland becomes the first Scottish-born pilot to travel to space. So that's another first for Scotland. How to build the perfect model railway. This is a miniature world set in central Scotland 60 years ago. And some good photographs again from that one. if you're interested in model railways, I think you'd enjoy reading that story. Then beavers to become protected species in Scotland. Says Environmental Secretary Rosanna Cunningham has said beavers will become a protected species in Scotland from May. I brought you another article about that. You can see there was pluses and minuses. So we'll see how this develops. Of course, with the beaver being a particularly Canadian symbol, it's another really interesting story. Then the Department for International Trade's no-deal planning is more advanced than the doomsdayers claim. It says Shanker points out that some of the UK's trading partners have been confused by the UK's EU negotiating strategy, given the potential for being locked into the EU customs union or having insufficient regulatory autonomy. So again, an interesting story there. Don't write off a failed entrepreneur. It says most attempts to bring something innovative to the market do not work. Accepting and overcoming failure is a large part of entrepreneurship. Not only do those trying to start something new learn what cannot take off, but the process of opening and closing a business makes success more likely the second time around. I've always been in great favour of that, and I certainly point out that in America they do embrace entrepreneurs that didn't make it, and more than happy to give them a second go, whereas in Britain you were isolated. So I think that's a really good paper, and I think everyone should read that. Okay, UK and US regulators build Brexit bridge for derivatives. It says Britain and the United States agreed on Monday a long-term pact to ensure the $2 trillion a day transatlantic market in derivatives will not be disrupted by any type of Brexit. So that's good news. Scottish Schools Young Writer of the Year. This is an annual thing, of course, sponsored by the Scottish Review. So I've given you a link to their root page where you can read some of the articles. Then dig at one of Scotland's largest hunter-gatherer sites. Evidence of human activity has been found going back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Again, a really interesting wee article, that. Then Wilson Raybould accuses Trudeau and other top Liberals of political interference over SNC Lavalin. She said the conversations were clearly inappropriate and included the suggestion that a collusion with the Prime Minister on these matters should be avoided. This is a really major story in Canada. It's dominating all the news headlines because the opposition have called for the Prime Minister Trudeau to resign because of it, and they've called for an RCMP investigation into it. So it's taking all the news headlines at the moment. Then, first ever Stornoway London flights announced by Loganair. It says Loganair today announced flights between Stornoway and London, the first airlink between the Scottish Islands and the UK capital. So that's a good news as well. Then, last story is I'd vote Leave more emphatically than in 2016. This is 3 farmers on why they still back Brexit. Okay, then on to Electric Canadian. Well, as usual, I'm doing the regulars, like the Canadian Archive reports. I've got the 1897 report up. The Canadian Annual Review of Public Affairs for 1920. I've got the Canadian Horticulturalist up, volume 15 for 1892. And Canadian Life and Resources. This is a monthly review of the devolved and undeveloped wealth of the Dominion of Canada and of Newfoundland. I've got volume 8, 1910 up for you to read. Then I've got the guide, a manual for the Canadian Militia Infantry. It was compiled by Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Otter, commanding the Queen's Own Rifles in 1880. I thought it would be interesting to look at it. I've got an old manual for the States and also for Britain, so I thought it would be good to have the one for Canada up. Types of Canadian women and of women who are or have been connected with Canada. Said it's by Henry James Morgan, and I've got your link so you can have a read of that book. Then I've also got Men and Women of the Time. This is again by Henry James Morgan, 1912. It's a handbook of Canadian biography. Then Inventory of Military Documents in the Canadian Archives. This is really a research document, so if you're interested in researching military matters, then this is a good book because it's giving you a link of all the military documents in the Canadian Archives, making it easier to find them basically. And then I have Roy Thomson, 1st Baron Thomson of Fleet. As a Canadian newspaper proprietor who became one of the moguls of Fleet Street. Also within there I've got an hour-long documentary that was done on him as well, so it makes a really interesting read, that. The Dominion Annual Register and Review. I found a couple of copies of this. This makes some good reading. This is the 16th year of the Canadian Union, 1882, and so I've got that for you to read. And then Post Media. It's a Canadian news media company representing hundreds of brands across multiple print, online and mobile platforms. And you can read about them on my page I've created for them. And then find Conrad Black. I've got 4 stories up from him. One of them I put in the news, right at the top of the page, because he actually comments about Brexit and Theresa May's efforts. And I thought it was rather an interesting point of view he brought up, so I thought you might like to read that, in fact, because that's a Canadian perspective on it. Okay, so that's that. On to Electric Scotland now. I've got another volume of the Scottish Reviews gone up, volume 26, July to October 1895. I've got Around the Ancient City and 6 circular tours. It's with notes on the ancient superstitions, folklore, eminent men and curious characters in various districts of Forfar and Kincardineshire. It's by David Herschel Edwards. And it's the 2nd edition, published in 1904. So I could read that one. Oh yes, an A1, Britain's Longest Road. I think I mentioned to you before that I've been watching a bit of YouTube on my television through the TVO service I get from Kojiko. And I'm actually finding things on YouTube I never knew existed on YouTube. And this is one. This is the A1, which is about 400 miles. It takes from London to the centre of Edinburgh. And it's not only following the traffic police and how they look after the road, but it also does little vinaigrettes, on particular people. Like, for example, they highlight one of the cafes who makes a special breakfast for everyone. Apparently it's hugely popular. Then there was another one I watched the other night there, which was about Christmas trees being packaged and headed down the A1 to deliver to the customers and stuff like that. And then a beekeeper, how they get his bees from the north of England down to southeast England, so they can help the apple crop down there. So that's why I like it. It's a good wee mix of stories there. And then Murdoch Stanley MacLeod. He's a businessman and philanthropist. He was born on the 18th of October 1893 at Cannington, South Australia. This is one of the Scots Australians, and I thought you might like to have a read of that. Then Glasgow to Edinburgh on board an Intercity 225. It's an hour or so train journey from Glasgow to Edinburgh. It's to be watched in our community. So it's not a particularly nice day, man. You snow on the ground and everything, but the tracks are quite complex actually, going through the main city centres and stuff. Okay, so Poems by Stanley Bruce. You maybe remember the other week there Stan sent in a couple of poems, and he also recorded them as well. So when you bring up the page for the poem, you can actually click the link and listen to it as well as reading it. So he sent 2 more to us, and I've added them to his poetry section within the page. The Memoir of Alexander, Bishop of Brechin. So with the brief notice of his brother, the Reverend George Hay Forbes. This is published in 1875. Then I have Bigger and the House of Fleming, but this is where I've added a couple of short videos to the page. Because as you know, when I do a feature of an area of Scotland, I like, if possible, to try and find some videos. And so I noticed when I went to the bigger page that there was no videos, so I put 2 up. And then the Brechin Almanac and Directory. I added the issue for 1892 and 1914 to the foot of our page on Brechin. And again, they're very good reads, lots of interesting wee stories in there, as well as the directory. And then finally, British nuclear testing in Australia gets 50,000 views in our community. As I said, Gordon posted a message on this topic, noting it had now received 50,000 views. It's a great store of information for anyone interested in the fallout from British nuclear testing in Australia and the seeking for compensation for the people affected. The first post went up on the 7th of August 2010 and is added to continually up to the last post made on 19th of January 2019. Because there are some videos no longer displaying thanks to YouTube, but the information is all there if you want to do some seriously good research. So well done, Gordon, great work you did there. And then the story I have for you this week, which takes up about 3/5 of the newsletter, it's Fragments of Caithness Folklore by Frank Binder. I'll read the first paragraph to set the scene. The Folklore Society has done much admirable work since its inception 20 years ago. In almost every part of the world, persons are now engaged in collecting, collating, and comparing legends, popular customs and sayings, in order that light may be thrown upon events of the past and beliefs of the present. The ardent folklorist investigates in true scientific fashion. Scrupulous heed is given to every detail and variation. Infinite pains are taken to separate, as far as may be, the ancient myth from the modern overgrowth. It is well that a systematic effort of this kind was instituted in time to rescue many of the oral traditions from the inevitable destruction which awaited them. The destruction incidental to the prevalence of the railroad, the school board, and the 19th century spirit of questioning. The national claim advances by many eminent folklorists that the study should be ranked as a science is however coincident with the disappearance of not a little of romance. It is difficult for attention to be concentrated upon the lessons of folklore and at the same time to preserve a keen appreciation of the colour, the picturesque suggestiveness of these old world thoughts and beliefs which have for generations been guarded by unlettered and whose emotional roots stretch back into the past. Analysis and romance are to a great extent incongruous. To employ the one, we must almost of necessity forego the other. So it says, no attempt is made in this paper to investigate scientifically the lore of the North. The aim of the writer is to recall and present simply a few fragments from that great storehouse of popular wisdom and tradition. It says the Celt of the Western Highlands and the Islands preserves his hold on the past largely by means of that elemental imagination and that ardent love of his birthplace and all connected therewith, which are his dominant characteristics. The folk of Caithness, Sutherland, and the Northern Isles, on the other hand, treasure with a quiet simplicity the lore which has come down to them, with also an unquestioning faith that is touching as well as beautiful. The modern spirit is here confronted by barriers of old world wisdom, of prejudice, if one will, which, unimportant as they may seem, have incalculable powers of resistance. So I hope you'll enjoy that story. I certainly enjoyed it myself. And of course, as far as Brexit goes, well, we're now in the final month, because March 29, so we've got some 4 weeks to go till we either leave or fudge the issue once again. But I would certainly recommend you have a wee read at Conrad Black's article on Brexit, because it certainly made me think a bit, on that. But anyway, I just hope we just leave, and then we can settle down and do a free trade deal with the EU and the rest of the world. Okay, so that's it for this week. I hope you all have a nice weekend when it comes, and feel free to leave any comments or suggestions about this newsletter, and I look forward to hearing from you. So have a good weekend when it comes. Cheers.